Ari, I just want to say regarding your programs, for those people who don't know, you do have a great backlog of videos on your YouTube channel, and I've been dipping into them, and there's some really great speakers, people that I admire, and some people I never heard of before, and terrific content. And if 3 lectures on Jewish sites in Central and Eastern Europe from me is not enough, but you're a newcomer, there are 4 lectures that I gave last fall about American synagogues. You can access those as well. But also Mark Epstein and David Kaufman, a lot of great other people have been giving programs this year. And then I'm just really looking forward to the Baumgarten event about Where Were the Women, because that, as I mentioned last week, that's a topic that is of great interest to me. As far as my biography, I will integrate some of that into the presentation today because to correct Ari, I've actually been involved in documenting and preserving Jewish monuments now for about 32 years, not 20. And those first 10 years were probably the most important and productive. So we don't want to, I don't want to slight them, and I'm going to refer to them because those were the years when, with the support of the World Monuments Fund and the United States Commission for the Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad, that's a mouthful, we really undertook, I don't want to say groundbreaking because it's really against Jewish law to dig in a cemetery unless you're digging a grave where there are no burials, but it was pioneering work to document the locations and the conditions of thousands of Jewish cemeteries across the countries of the former Soviet bloc, those countries that had been communist and had recently gained their a kind of democratic independence in 1989, 1990 and following. And it opened up the opportunity to travel in those places and to work in partnerships with governmental and NGO groups and with Jewish communities to really start a new era in understanding the Jewish past in these places. And whether it's Central Europe or Eastern Europe, I think that's a matter of perspective. From America, we saw the so-called Iron Curtain as dividing the West from the East. So anything that was communist was automatically Eastern Europe. But from the perspective of countries like the former Czechoslovakia, but particularly the Czech Republic, which sort of reaches out geographically into sort of Germany and Austria, and Poland, which actually now occupies a good part of what was Prussia, a good part of what was Germany. Culturally, they see themselves aligned much more with the West until Soviet Russian domination through the czars and then through the communists. So they really want to, they aspire to be, yes, central, both geographically and politically to the European experiment, shall we say. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about documentation, and to make Ari happy, I've included a bit of some cemeteries that I know he has some connections with. There are so many cemeteries that it's very hard to make generalizations and to cover everything. So we're just going to dip in a bit here and there, but we'll try to explore some general themes. The thrust of this talk is about the, trying to get to go to the next slide. The thrust of this is about the range of types of cemeteries and their condition, and about different situations that I've found and others have found, and the ways people have engaged to conserve, restore, whatever. So this is not really a history of Jewish cemeteries, but some historical questions will come up, and you can feel free to send questions in the chat to Ari, and if we have time, we'll cover some of them later. I will refer to some excellent resources which have a lot of this material, but it varies from place to place. So we have many types of Jewish cemeteries. The only thing they have in common is they have Jews buried in them. They are big and small, they're urban and they're rural. They're full of artistically significant carved gravestones, or they have no gravestones at all. They are relatively well preserved, like the old Jewish cemetery in Prague, or they've entirely vanished, like this example from near Ternopil in Ukraine, which was photographed by my friends Marla and Jay, who are on the call today. The RJH, which you'll see on several photographs, refers to Rohatyn Jewish Heritage, which is their organization, which you'll learn more of later. But both of these are cemeteries. A Jewish cemetery is always a Jewish cemetery, unless perhaps under rabbinic supervision, which is very, 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 very rare. All the bodies have been exhumed. It's against Jewish law to open a Jewish grave and to remove the body. So it only happens in the most extreme circumstances. So even if there are no gravestones, the assumption is the bodies are still in the ground, and the function as a cemetery continues. The gravestones are not for the dead. The gravestones are for the living. And the cemeteries are a garden of life, if you will, as it's called in Hebrew and Jewish tradition, a garden of the living, but it refers to the dead as being living and essentially having some eternal resting place, and perhaps, depending on the people who buried them, some aspirations or some expectation for a living in a messianic age. But where we talked last week about synagogues, that there were thousands of them. I estimated maybe there were 12,000 or 15,000 synagogues and prayer houses, but only physical remnants of perhaps 1,000 still survive in Central and Eastern Europe. A synagogue goes away. A building is destroyed. It's no longer a synagogue. You say there was a synagogue there. You could put a plaque or a sign, but there's no particular sacrality associated with the building when it's no longer used, or any purpose to protect the site by Jewish law or by any other custom if the building is gone. But a cemetery is inviolate. So there are 10 or 11,000 cemeteries. We believe there are about 10 or 11,000 cemeteries in Central and Eastern Europe, and every one of them is still a cemetery. They don't all have gravestones. They don't have walls and fences. They don't all have signposts. They're not even all on lists, although most of them now are on lists. We've been working on those lists for a long, long time. But as long as there's a Jewish burial there, it is still a cemetery. And according to Jewish law and Jewish custom, it deserves the same respect and the same attention as any other cemetery. We don't rank them and saying this one is better than another. There's equality in death in Judaism, and everybody is deserving of the same respectful and safe and secure resting place. Okay. So why do we save cemeteries? Why are we interested in them beyond this religious obligation? And we'll certainly get to that, come back to that again. And just like I talked about different purposes for synagogue preservation or interest in synagogue conservation and reuse, there are similar interests for cemeteries. And I'll start with the personal one, because that's where I started last time, the family history. We all want to connect with our ancestors. Well, most of us, some of us hate our families. We don't want that, but most people want to connect with their ancestors, certainly their immediate family. And then there's a general sense of wanting to know where we came from. And this has only been heightened because of a history of migration, of emigration and immigration, where people have been separated from their family roots, and they want to connect. And often the only physical connection is the cemetery. And if one is lucky enough, as I am in my family, to have ancestors who come from a town where a cemetery wasn't destroyed and we can still find the gravestones, there is that physical connection to the stone itself. The memorial is there as testimony to the virtues of the deceased, but it is also there as a message to the future, to tell the children and the grandchildren who this person was, where they were, and at least in a generic way, that they were worthy of remembrance. And we say Kaddish every year. We remember people's yard site. Generally, after 50 years, it's considered we don't have to say Kaddish anymore, but doesn't mean we cease to remember our antecedents. And with the genealogical research of the last 20 years, the explosion of that, there's obviously been intense research in trying to trace these roots. So this is me on a second visit to Radutz. I showed you a picture when I didn't have a beard and had longer hair from 1973. Last time, this is 1978. And here I'm in the cemetery. It's winter, which is a great time to visit cemeteries. Sometimes it's the only time that you can really get to see everything, or at least until recently. Now there's been more systematic clearance of vegetation. And this is my father's grandmother, my great-grandmother on my father's side, Ethel Gruber. There are other reasons that we're interested in saving cemeteries or exploring cemeteries and documenting them. The epitaphs themselves, like this one, usually in Hebrew until the 19th century, then increasingly in vernacular languages, either as well or instead of. The Radutz Cemetery has gravestones in, I think, 5 different languages because it's one of these borderlands. So there is Hebrew and Yiddish and German and Russian, and I don't know what the 5th would be, so I may be wrong, but I thought there were 5, but close enough. The point is, things change. The first visit, we were lucky enough, because we didn't read Hebrew, to know Ethel Gruber. We saw the Roman letters. Subsequent investigation showed up other earlier ancestors where the epitaphs are only in Hebrew. So these are an archive of epitaphs. It's like a census of the people who lived and died in those towns. If it was complete, it would be a major resource for demographers, sociologists. It is very important for linguists, for literary historians, for epigraphers, many biblical scholars, because what texts are being chosen to be quoted, poetry scholars, because a lot of poetic language is used in these inscriptions. And the same is true, we'll see, with art. A little bit we can learn about gender. In this case, women generally have the Shabbat candles on their gravestones. Men have more things to represent them. There's an importance that the cemetery still surviving is proof that the Jewish community was there, even when they're no longer Jews. So that's very important, just like the synagogue last time. Also, it can be a very important place in a landscape, and many cemeteries are beautiful. And even as we know in America, in the 19th century, cemeteries doubled as public parks. That's where people went to stroll for recreation. In Europe too, the cemeteries were often places people went to visit their ancestors, but also to canoodle a bit too, because there weren't that many places where you could have some privacy. So young people would go to the cemeteries. Today, unfortunately, we get young people who might go and be rowdy and leave beer cans, and they have no respect. But there was a sense, this was a garden. It was a garden of the living, then in more ways than one, in this case, for the living and active too. So these are more, relatives of my sister at our great-grandmother's grave, Chaya Dvorah Herer Halpern, born in 1836. We found this with the help of a local genealogist and researcher who has been documenting all of the stones. And here you can see many variations of the candlesticks, which indicates that this is a section of women. So the women and the men are probably separate here. Here is Gaia Devora's husband. Over here, my cousin Beth, standing there. And he's a learned man, so he gets a bookshelf there. There's also a connection today, because of the Holocaust, of these cemeteries with Holocaust history. Their very survival is essentially a commemoration. These are the people who died generally before the Holocaust, so they had the luxury of having a real grave, but those who didn't are remembered in different ways through monuments and memorials. We'll talk about that next week. But just the very fact that we see the history of a town spread out in all of the graves, often in many different sections that cover many different generations, that's evidence to us of the culture that was destroyed by the devastation, by the cruelty, by the horror of the Holocaust. So it tells us something there too. Sometimes the message is much more specific. This is a photo from, I believe it's also from Radowitz. This is my father's aunt. Her husband, Joseph, was the brother of my grandfather, and he and his son, Zvi, which would be Hirsch, but because they all spoke German, became Hermann. They were killed in what's called the Zacharesti massacre, which was one of these very, very awful, violent murders where the Romanian soldiers who were retreating from Bukovina and Bessarabia that had been taken over by the Soviet Union in 1939, 1940, they took out their anger on local Jewish populations. And the Zacharesti massacre, 36 people were rounded up from little villages, and they were brutally murdered. Brutally, we have accounts, and I won't go into it now, but we'll look at this monument that's in the Chusteva cemetery a little bit more next week, but you'll see their names, Joseph and Hermann Gruber. And then they were interred later in a family grave. In behind is a Herrer who's also an ancestral family, and this is the widow and the mourning mother. We have a lot of signs of piety, and piety sort of runs through all of these themes: family or filial piety, piety about the sacrosanct quality of burial and the possibility of maybe eternal life, and piety of respect, and many acts of restoration or intervention in cemeteries today are both driven by family remembrance, but also this sense of piety. And here's a remarkable instance where we have an old photograph that was supplied by Naomi Musiker, and a South African who's Lithuanian descent, I believe. And this is a photo, a family photo from the 30s. And then these same graves survived and they've been restored. And that's an unusual opportunity, but we can see the parallelism here. So piety and pilgrimage for religious reasons comes up against pilgrimage for today, for tourism and for political reasons. And all of these reasons, you know, the history and the art are very important, but also obviously for Jews in local communities, it's very important to show off their standing, that they are not strangers, they are not interlopers, that they are have deep history, often deeper than some of the so-called majority cultures amongst whom they reside today. So this is a very famous painting from the Burial Society of Prague. It's part of a series that's you can see when you go to Prague today, but it's reciting prayers, annual prayers at the grave of Rabbi Lew. And here we see Leo Pavlet, who's the director of the museum and the head of the Jewish community, and taking Michelle Obama around the cemetery when she was First Lady. And she didn't have to wait in line. That's what I remember. That was a big deal. But piety shows up in many less public ways. And this is an old pre-Holocaust photograph of a family visiting graves. I believe this is Ukrainian. It looks somewhat like Brody, but I don't think it is. I'm not sure where this photo is from. Someone perhaps has identified it. And then here is a woman with her crutches, and she's seated before the rabbi's graves, also in Ukraine, in an ohel there. This is a rebuilt ohel. An ohel, the word means tent, but really it's just a little house that was often erected on a Jewish cemetery over the graves of particularly important sages or tzaddiks or important leaders. It was a way to protect the grave, but also to provide shelter for their followers who would want to come and pray in close proximity to the graves. This is the rebuilt ohel, funded presumably by, I don't know who funded this, but Hasidic groups were funding these in the 90s and early 2000s. They still may be doing this. So sometimes you would have no work on a cemetery overall, but a single ohel would be rebuilt. And this is the Hasidic dynasty of the rabbis of Przemyśl. And I was castigated by my sister, who she's my harshest critic, for my murdering of the Hungarian language last week. So I'm hesitant to attempt the Ukrainian, but it's Przemyślani, and there basically there's a field, a very little left, a few stones in the cemetery. There's no wall, I believe, around the cemetery. I've been there, but I can't remember for sure. And but inside the ohel, they were able to excavate these incredibly Baroque, carved Baroque gravestones of the various rabbis of the dynasty, and they've been put in almost coffin-like boxes, and they're lying flat because they're all in fragments. And all of the people come and leave prayers on the different graves. So that's piety. They're not looking at these gravestones as great works of art, but they really are stunning. This is in Belz, Ukraine. I had the pleasure of actually working with the Belz Hasids on some projects here in Belz. They were terrific to work with. And I helped come up with a deal sort of with the Belz Hasids and the local archaeological authorities and cultural authorities, so they could all understand each other, because they were all coming from different perspectives and they had different goals. But I thought they all basically had the same goal. And so a friend of mine who's somehow my name made it to like the second in charge of and they asked me to come and mediate a big meeting. And so we all came to Belz and we had a big meeting, and it created a wonderful working relationship between the local authorities and the Belz Hasidim. They had already restored this cemetery, and they had already created a kind of synagogue there, but they were interested in the old rabbi's house, which is under a soccer field, and they were in the mikveh and other things. And I believe work is still going on in Belz to expand this sort of archaeological park that also functions as a religious center. And you can see how beautifully carved these stones are. These were all re-erected. They'd all been leveled, and they were re-erected. Many stones were lost, but fortunately the stones of many of the major rabbis are still there. And a new fence was put around this place as well. So here we're back in Prague. There's for some people, there's real tension between the religious needs and views of a cemetery and the demands of tourism. I don't think there need to be any tension. And generally, we need both. The religious kind of often can spearhead an effort to protect a site because they're ones who know its history and are often the most, they have the most at stake. And they're ready to go, literally to go to the barricades to prevent desecration of this site. So they'll have a demonstration. They'll picket outside of an embassy. They'll threaten, agencies who might be involved, and that's good. But to save a site also requires engagement and continued year-end recognition. So tourism is good too, and tourism usually brings money into local economies, and local people then can be hired as caretakers, and they might have hotel rooms, they might have a bar, a restaurant. So that helps too. Obviously, Prague, which the old cemetery in Prague has the largest number of visitors of any Jewish cemetery in the world. I'm pretty sure about that. And the museum, of which this is all sort of part, is the first or second most popular museum in all of the Czech Republic, Jewish or not Jewish. So it is a major economic engine for Prague itself, and especially because it is owned by the Jewish community, it is a major source of income for the Jewish community. Early on, the Czechs were very, very smart about how to go about saving their cemeteries. They were the first out of the starting gate to set up essentially a fund and a separate arm of their community that would be tasked solely with the protection, conservation, restoration of cemeteries. And they came up with a lot of very useful economic strategies. And they didn't siphon off money, say from income from the museum, into, junkets for their leadership. The money they were getting from the museum went into the protection of and restoration of their cemeteries and synagogues. Also, the Czech government under Václav Havel was very, very generous, well, legally sort of responsible. They returned properties to the Jewish community very early in the 1990s, when almost every other country balked at doing that and took a decade or more. So very early, by 1992 or 3, I think, the Czech Jewish community had income-producing properties as Prague was becoming a mecca for, no, never a mecca, I guess. It became a magnet for tourists from all over the world. And this income then also was reinvested in supporting their programs, including, helping old people, but a lot of it went to cemeteries and synagogues too. They had professional managers, and they set up a private affiliated company called Matana, and their only job was to take care of cemeteries. And I've traveled around looking at Czech cemeteries as early as 1990, 1991, when everything was overgrown and walls were broken and things like that. And then as late as 2018. And I mean, it is just extraordinary, the work that's taken place. But I was rereading a report that I wrote around 2004 or something like that. And already at that time, the numbers of sites that had received 10% to 100% conservation work was extraordinary. So the Czechs are really great at this, and they provide a great model. Others have done okay, and others have done really badly and have been very slow, and we'll see some of the results. So here I am at one of the most famous Czech graves. This is in Mladá Boleslav. This is Jacob Bassevi, who was one of the great, he was a sort of like the first noble Jew, and he had a lot of money and a lot of power and a lot of prestige, but he died while he was traveling. So because of Jewish law, you have to, the body can't be kept in a house overnight, and you have to be buried the next day. So he was buried where he was in Mladá Boleslav. But his family, they did put up this great gravestone. His wife's grave, though, is one of the most notable graves in the Prague cemetery, one that everybody sees. Okay, now for Ari, let's talk about a very different famous cemetery, and we'll see it go through it fairly quickly. There is so much we could do a whole program just on the cemetery in Warsaw, the Okapowa Street Cemetery, defined by this wall. But let's just take a minute to talk about walls, because there's a sense that that every Jewish cemetery is walled or fenced. And that's not true. It's not true. Many were and some were not. And we'll in the Middle Ages, we know that cemeteries were walled. They were far from the city. And so for the protection of the graves, they were often walled to really protect the boundaries so people didn't encroach on the land. And that's still a problem. And that's one of the reasons we put up fences today, to protect the boundaries, to recognize the boundaries. Also to keep out animals from foraging, wild animals, because these cemeteries were out in the country. But sometimes they were just separated by, they were marked by stones, or there were ditches. In this case, there was a big ditch between the town of Warsaw and the cemetery, because the cemetery was outside of the town, and that was always the case with Jewish cemeteries. Where there's a Jewish cemetery in a town today, like if you go to Kazimierz in Krakow, on Szeroka Street, there's a little park. That was the first Jewish cemetery there. That was not part of the city at the time. It was created as a cemetery. And then Kazimierz was only incorporated into Krakow much, much later. So ditches were fine, but the boundary of the cemetery had to be clearly demarcated. And that is, again, for religious reasons, reasons of ritual purity. You don't want someone to get too close to a dead body if they're not supposed to, like if they're one of the Kohanim, or you don't want non-Jews encroaching. You don't want frivolous activity encroaching. So there are lots of reasons, and as well as vandals and animals and that sort of thing. This wall was only built in the 1930s. So this is a very defining aspect of the cemetery, but it's the last part of it. The cemetery was first founded in 1806, I believe, and then was expanded many times to the 20s, 40s, 50s, and finally in the 1860s. But to its enormous size today, it is about 85 acres, I believe, 30 some hectares, very, very large. And they're thought to be about 250,000 graves. Not all of them are marked. Not all of them were probably originally marked. Poor people may not have had stone markers, but many, many gravestones were destroyed, particularly during the Holocaust. But even, I think even in World War I, there were some destroyed, and then during the communist period. So the cemetery has gone through really tough times. I first visited it in 1990. These photographs are actually from 1992, because when I went in 1990, it was June, and it was essentially impossible to get into the cemetery. You could get to the entrance, but it was so overgrown. There was no way to really penetrate. But when I went back in the winter of 92, and my guide was Jan Jagielski, who just died this year. We lost so many great people this year. Jan, already then in 1992, they were beginning the first clearance and restoration projects through the Jewish Historical Institute and other agencies. So I'm going really slow. I got to speed up here. But this is what it looked like. It was overgrown and lots of broken stones throughout. This is a picture taken from the Facebook page of the cemetery just from March during the pandemic. And again, winter is a great period for exploring cemeteries. It is the best period for documentation, not the best period for preservation, but for documentation, because it's the only time you can really see everything. Here's the wall. This is 2013. I was there. They were doing work on the wall. This is the back wall of the cemetery. Here's the map. It's very big. Signage is very important. And what we're seeing now in many, many cemeteries, if I said there are 11,000 cemeteries, probably only, we'd be lucky if we said 500 of them had good signage, maybe not even that many, but we're getting more and more signage. This, of course, is still a cemetery in use, very important, so there's good signage inside. Also, there are websites that are devoted to this. The Virtual Shtetl website, which is affiliated with the Polin Museum, I believe, still has a lot on this and hundreds of photos of stones. But you can also browse this website for information on all of the cemeteries and all of the shtetls in modern day Poland. There's also another big documentation site, and this is in affiliation with the Jewish community in Warsaw, as well as other organizations and foundations and the Ministry of Culture. And this site is trying to document actually who's buried where, and to include epitaphs and inscriptions. And you can spend days and days browsing this, and you can see there's also an English page. I haven't gone deep into it, so I don't know whether everything is in English, but it's a great resource. The cemetery, has been fixed up more and more, and right now there's a very aggressive action to really get it into shape. It's so huge, this will still take decades. This is already in the late 90s. Different donors were coming forward to do different things. This is the restoration of an original gate, but it's set up as an independent monument. It is not a gate. It doesn't go anywhere. It's on this walkway that you see here, where many of the most impressive graves are. And this is the closest to Okapova Street, and it was the first area that was sort of cleared and kept clear. And there's a big path that's sort of a promenade that you see here on the right. But in 2006, you can see there was a concerted campaign to get donors, including many American donors, to help pay for the repaving of a lot of these paths. And so we have somebody from Texas and somebody here, I don't know where they're from, but Joseph Clark, and a number of these plaques are around the cemetery today. The cemetery is remarkable for its sculpture. We know, well, I don't know, but art historians know who many of the sculptors are. They were very prominent people in the late 19th and early 20th century. And these are some of the best examples of Art Nouveau sculpture in the Jewish tradition. These are just 3 samples that I took when I was there in 2013. I've been to the cemetery many times. This was one of the, but it always seems to be raining or it's cloudy. This was a good day, so I was able to take a lot of pictures. Movie gets a 2023 release date. Sorry, my phone just went off. And a number of famous people are buried here as well. The actress Kaminska, Meyer Balaban, the great historian, and this is on the right is a monument to the ghetto fighters. So this is what a lot of the cemetery looks like today. A lot of the trees have been cleared. This was almost solid trees because it was 50, 60 years of growth, all unplanned growth. And of course, the tree roots knock over the stones. The trees, these are not trees that live long, so they fall down, they break stones. So there wasn't so much vandalism. There was a lot of trash because people would just go there, have parties and that kind of stuff. But the vandalism tended to be natural, not anti-Semitic, so to speak. And you can see that at one point, this I believe was in the 1990s, in that period that I mentioned, a lot of the stones were being inventoried. So you see these red painted markers on them. So now there's been a lot of clearing, but what happens when there's clearing, you see how bad the situation is. You couldn't see this in 1990, but today, and this is true for cemeteries throughout Central and Eastern Europe. We clear them because we're very eager to clear them, but then we see how bad they are, and we look at projects to conserve and restore them that can cost tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars, or in the case of the Warsaw Cemetery, many millions of dollars, and this will be an ongoing thing. Individual works of art and tombs have been restored, particularly the Bear Sonnenberg monument from the early 19th century, which is considered one of the great works of Jewish art. And I've written about that, and other people have too. This is just a sampling of some of the grander stones. And in this area right here, right by the Bear Sonnenberg, just this year during the pandemic, there's been a lot of this conservation work going on. You can see some cleaning of stones here and fixing stones, but there's been archaeological work. So this is a report that my sister put up on her Jewish Heritage Europe site in October. and it reports on a lot of the archaeology that was going on during the pandemic, because the cemetery was closed to the public. So actually it was a great time. And what they did, there's been so much accumulated earth. You know, I said you can't dig in a cemetery. Well, that's not true. You can't dig beneath what was the ground level at the time of burial. But over the last 70 years, since 1940, so more, the last 80 years, a lot of sediment has built up of all of the falling leaves and a lot of trash. And some of these gravestones were covered with soil halfway up. And so this was excavated, and they found lots of debris, some of it associated with the cemetery, some of it associated with the period of the Holocaust and the ghetto, some of it post-war. They got down to an earlier level of cobble paving that they didn't even know was there in certain areas. So it's very exciting work. And this is on the Jewish Community website, and you can also read it on Jewish Heritage Europe in English. And now for something totally different. So this is for Ari again. Here's Pakruojis. We looked at the wooden synagogue in Lithuania, Pakruojis last time, much too brief a visit. But outside of town is the so-called new cemetery, which you can see is very remote, very rural, nothing like Warsaw at all. And this is all that's left. And by walking around the cemetery and doing a little reconnaissance beyond the boundaries, it was very easy for me, because I have experience in this, to ascertain, without even looking at a map, that the boundaries of the cemetery had once been much more extensive. But because so few stones survive today, the modern conservators just have put a fence around this area. So there are probably bodies, Jewish bodies, surrounding this, and perhaps even in areas, maybe not that has been used for agricultural land, but is sometimes a problem. In my own ancestral town of Calvaria, which I'm not going to show you today, that's a big problem because it was a huge cemetery. And there's only a clump of about 40 or 50 gravestones that are all together and right by a big power pole. And the fence goes around these stones, but you know that the cemetery covered acres. And a lot of that is now being used for agricultural land. Must be very rich soil. But you know, the graves are below the plow levels, but as we use heavier plows today, there is almost certainty that there will be disturbance of graves. So again, this is a picture of what it looked like in 1992. What did we do in 1992 when we got there, and how did we begin the work? Well, in 1990, 1991, I started with the World Monuments Fund and in partnership with the US Commission for Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad, which had been founded in the 80s as a kind of front for Orthodox rabbis to go challenge communist officials to get access to cemeteries, to protect cemeteries. There was no budget or anything like that. But then after 1990, there was a little bit of money, not much, and there was a little bit of more professionalism. And they reached out to the World Monuments Fund, me in particular with the Jewish Heritage Program, and asked whether we would partner to do countrywide surveys of Jewish heritage sites. And we began with Poland, the Czech Republic. We were going to do Czechoslovakia, then the countries split, and we just did the Czech Republic. We did a little bit of Slovakia, and Hungary. The Hungary one never got finished the way it should have been because of budget problems and an organization problem. But Poland, we were able to piggyback on work that had been done by local preservation officials under communism, documenting cemeteries, as you see here in these photos from the Białystok region. And we were able to team up with people who had been doing this kind of research. So that's Jan Jagielski on the left, who helped run our survey, he and Eleonora Bergman from the Jewish Historical Institute. This is a similar effort out of the University of St. Petersburg that was being done somewhat later, documenting this. A lot of these people then have emigrated to Israel, and many of them are working today at the Center for Jewish Art. This is actually the last survey on the right that I ever did. It's in Estonia, and it's the cemetery, I think that's furthest east. It was in Narva, Estonia, all the way on the edge of where the Russian border is. And we got there at the end of a very long day driving. And I'm with one of the heads of the Jewish community in Tallinn, and with Lee Seaman, a member of the commission who was traveling with me. And we had vague directions where we might find the cemetery. And we tracked through the woods, and eventually the sun was setting, we found it, and it was deep in the woods. And I have some other pictures of it that I'll show you later. So not everything was open and clear landscape. Things were often very, very hard to find. And there still are cemeteries that are being found to this day. And then also there's a big effort, particularly in Ukraine, for the last 10 or 12 years, there's been a big effort to also identify mass grave sites. These are some of the reports that we put out, and these are all available online. And then these reports were summaries of extensive documentations. We had questionnaires with 75 questions, and lots of local people going out, fanning out around the country to visit cemeteries and find out information. So most of this work was done in the 90s, but often it took a long time to codify the information and to write the reports. The Ukraine report, I was just rereading, and actually I was surprised how relevant it still is today. It's quite useful. Okay, so Jewish Heritage Europe has a big reference on cemeteries, lots of resources there. The European, the ESJF survey for Jewish cemeteries has been getting huge grants from the Germans and the EU, and they've been doing a lot of fencing projects and documentation projects, and you can look at their website, and we'll put up all these links. And this is the site that Marla and Jay have done, a guide to Jewish cemetery preservation in Western Ukraine. And it's I can't press on these because this is, maybe I can. No, I can't. Because this is just a screenshot, but it is very deep. It has lots of materials. Okay, it's getting to be almost 8 o'clock. So I really am not very deep into this, into the material. So I'm just going to go through and show you some pictures for about 5 minutes, and then we'll finish up. Cemeteries are gardens. Sometimes they were intentional. This one's on Florence on the left, and often they're unintentional, just overgrowth. And then landscape is very beautiful. Sometimes it's intentional. On the right, as you see from the Czech Republic, and on the left, this is Busk in Ukraine. Also very pretty, but it's partly beautiful and romantic because of the destruction of the cemetery. There are only a few stones left. This is Vadorashkov in Moldova, and a massive cemetery with very important stones and inscriptions and decoration. And this needs to be, I believe this still needs to be fully documented. We did a survey of it about 10 years ago. So landscape is unintentional. This rural feel, there's a horse, in Krinky, but a lot of the stones have been robbed, and they were used at the time, this was 1990, to build a pigsty. And one of the things this is Narva. This is what, trudging through the forest and then finding a robbed wall and just a few stones in Estonia. One of the things that happens when you take away the vegetation is you find there's a lot of destruction. This is in Bulgaria, where most of the cemeteries have been vandalized, ravaged. People opening up the graves looking for grave goods, even though Jews are not buried with grave goods. This is Drohobych. I visited this in about 2000, and it was totally overgrown, and you couldn't walk in the cemetery. And then it was cleared, and these are not this is my photograph from 2006, and it was totally cleared. And what you saw was just destruction everywhere. There weren't any stones at all. Just a sad state. Okay, and then let's end with this one. This is one I saw in 2018. It's Biała in Poland, just north of the Czech Republic in Silesia. And it's an interesting case study because it's marked not by this cross, which is a memorial cross for something else, but there's a little sign here that says Jewish cemetery. And then there's an informational sign here with information in 4 languages, tells us something of the history of the site. But then you have to go down this path and you find the old broken wall. This used to have a wall, but the wall's been robbed. And then you get into this forest site. And the site has actually been cleaned because it would have been much denser at other times. But nothing has been actually, there's been no intervention on any of the stones. And you can see at some point they were inventoried. So it's important to note, cemeteries change all the time depending on the time of year you visit. I said winter was very good for seeing things, summer generally not, but in this case, this was summer, but it had been, someone had gone through with a weed whacker and cleared that a lot. And then is totally different is this incredible site. We'll talk about this next week because there are Holocaust memorials associated with it. But this is Sūduva in Lithuania, where there's been a multi-million euro project to restore the cemetery. The wall's been rebuilt, the area's whole been cleared, stones have been consolidated. Look, by the entrance, you even have a bucket of water for ritual cleansing and stones that people can put on graves. And the very creative solution of creating a lapidarium monument for all of the fragments that were found there. This is a remarkable place. It's a huge site. You can see the wall in the distance. So a very expensive undertaking. And then a museum is going to be opened here soon. I don't believe it's opened yet, but a museum, a shtetl museum, which is intended to tell something of the small town history of Jews in Lithuania. Sergei Konovich has been the guiding force, the brains, the spirit behind this, and he's really visionary in his ideas, and he's indefatigable and incredibly ambitious. I never would have believed a project like this could be done in Lithuania. All right, so we'll stop there. Even though I have more to say, maybe I'll do an add-on like I did last year to show some of these other things. But I would like to I'm going to give you a taste. I want to skip way to the end because I want to show you the last slide. This comes from Jay and Marla's site. Because I want to say who's going to be caring for these places? Who do these sites belong to? And obviously, as Jews, we have an intense interest in them and an affection. But most of us are not living in these places. Very few Jews live in these countries, and in most of these towns, there haven't been Jews for decades, if not even since the Holocaust. So we have to rely on local people to be interested, and we have to engage them. And one of the great new innovations of the last 10 or so years has been the incredible emergence of effective educational programs, partnership programs, engagement programs. Early on, I mean, there were priests who would get people from the church to clean the cemetery or some school children, but this is much bigger and it's much more systematic. And that's the way these places will be saved for the future, by getting people to understand the history, to learn about the history, and then have a proprietary interest in taking, by putting work in to clean these places and to protect them. They will then respect them and love them, and they will be the guardians of these houses of living for Jews in the future. Okay, so that'll be it for tonight, and I might do a little bonus episode to give you a few more examples. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you mind unsharing the screen? We'll do some Q&A. So, yeah, there's a lot to talk about, and we appreciate what we saw today, and looking forward to the bonus episode. Here are a few questions that people have been chatting as the lecture has been going on. Well, first of all, I want to say that we've done 3 CSP trips to New York City, 1 trip to Lithuania and Poland, 2 trips to to Israel. And I have to say that we go to cemeteries now when we go on our trips, obviously in Lithuania and Poland, but in New York City. Why? Because it's an awesome place to learn about history. to stand by the graves, to see who's there. You can stand by the grave of famous people or people that belong to certain guilds or certain parts of the fabric of that Jewish community, and then you can study their history right next to where they were buried, and it's amazing. It's a great learning opportunity. The other thing I will say is I've been doing a lot of genealogy research, and gravestones are really important because they can tell you the next generation, because it tells you who the father or mother was, father mostly, I guess, of the person that's buried there. And if you can find burial information about someone, you can find also maybe where their ancestors came from if they're not buried in Eastern Europe. So it's an amazing resource for us and something that we have to keep. Of course, as you mentioned, there are some great cemeteries that are intact or mostly intact, and some that have nothing. And it's pretty challenging when you find nothing. So here are some quick questions that people have asked. Number one, how are cemeteries in Eastern Europe and Central Europe that are Jewish cemeteries protected from being developed and used, like you just mentioned, for other uses like farming? You know.
Well, the best way is to have them listed. Well, there are two ways. If they're owned by the Jewish community, then they're not likely to be developed. There have been some instances, but the community's got in big trouble. So through the restitution process, there were big efforts to get cemeteries given back to Jewish communities, but many Jewish communities didn't have the resources to maintain them and sometimes balked on taking these. So ideally, they might cut a deal with a local municipality or a regional government that they would own them and protect them, but there would be guarantees that they would be inviolate and never developed. Fortunately, most of the Jewish cemeteries are far enough out from the cities that they're not really endangered, but during the communist period, so those are the cemeteries that are still, have stones preserved and are still visible. There were a lot of cemeteries developed during the Communist Party period that were closer to the city. So Drohobych, where I showed you that big cemetery that was all demolished after, when we cleared the vegetation was cleared, there was another cemetery in Drohobych which was closer in, and that has apartment buildings built on it now. So our survey identified both of them, but we could really get no information from the one that had already been developed. Many cemeteries were destroyed for development, but also for other reasons, essentially anti-Semitic reasons, during the communist period. So the big cemetery, in which I will put in the bonus episode and tell that story in Vilnius, for instance. But really, both cemeteries in Vilnius, the older one where a sports center was built on top of it, and then the later one where they took 70,000 stones and smashed them all up to use them for building material in other places. Both of those are instances of a worst case situations. But there's been some, a little bit of resolution on at least one of those cemeteries, as stones are now being retrieved and brought back to the original place. That's one of the things that Jay and Marla have been doing a lot in Western Ukraine is documenting where stones have gone, and then working with people to retrieve stones and have them brought back to the cemetery sites. This has also been happening a lot in Poland. And since the opening of the Polin Museum back in 2014, there's been a big interest in Jewish heritage throughout the entire country, among non-Jews, and people who've known where stones are, and they've known this for a long time, have been telling Jewish officials, have been calling the museum because they never had a place where they could communicate this information. And stones are being brought back to local Jewish cemeteries and to other places. So we're seeing that as well. I'll take another question.
So I guess two questions related to headstones. I saw and I've seen some headstones have color in them.
Yes.
So the older, was that common? And do we just like synagogue buildings, we don't understand what the colors were, or is that unusual to have color, in the headstones?
Yes, it was very common. But first, on the other question, let me just say another way to protect things is to have the cemeteries listed as historic monuments, and that's one of the things the U.S. Commission was doing. And one of the reasons why we were doing the surveys was actually to draw up lists, because they couldn't put anything on a list of monuments unless they knew where it was and had a little historical information. So we were trying to do this. We were more successful in some countries than in others. And generally, if there were no stones visible, most governments balked upon about having it as a historic monument because they define things through art and not through religion. So that was very important. But there are other ways to move forward. Color, yes, stones. Many stones were painted, and we have examples from Radwitz, where my family was. There's beautiful painted things. There's several instances in Poland and I believe in Ukraine too, where stones have been recovered that had been used for paving stones for roads and courtyards and things like that taken during the Nazi period. And because they've been put face down, because they wanted to use the smooth surface for the paving, when they were lifted up, they found that the color was very well preserved. There's also a cemetery near Łódź, blanking on the name, that has a lot of colored stones. The question is, were all stones colored? Were all stones painted? Probably not. But a lot more than we see today were painted. And the only way to really trace this is to do kind of a spectral analysis. And you can do that. Stone conservators can do this very easily. And it's the same thing that Professor Steve Fine did on the Arch of Titus to find that there are traces of gold pigment, that the thing was actually painted back in antiquity. So probably more stones were painted. We will find more that were painted, but my guess is not all of them were painted. So what we have to understand is, why were they painted? And if some were painted and some were not, why? Was it a question of money? Was it a question of taste? Was it a question of local custom? Was it just a question of style? So maybe in 1820, they didn't paint them, but in 1840, somebody said, oh, let's paint them. We just don't know. But Marlon, Jay, if you know anything about that, because you've been looking at some painted things, do you have any more information on that? No, okay.
But a question related to the work of Marla and Jay, because I did look at their website, and I think it alludes to everything you're talking about. What should we do with headstones that we find? So you find random headstones that are pieces of headstones, for example. You don't know where to put them. You know they belong to some cemetery. What do you do with those headstones? You showed us one example in Sedua, but I think Marla and Jay didn't. I just see something where they worked on taking headstones to make it into some kind of overall monument. So just a question from your perspective, what do you do with headstones?
We'll talk about that a lot next week, but already soon after the Holocaust, by 1948, there were a few monuments that returning survivors built on damaged cemeteries, where they would pile up the matzevot and they would create a monument. And then some of these were maintained and other ones just fell apart. In the cemetery at the Remu Cemetery in Krakow, and you saw it also in the Warsaw Cemetery, I didn't point it out, a number of places they took fragments and they made like walls, memorial walls. And that was the beginning of a tradition that then became much more common, beginning probably, I think, in the 1980s. The big monument at Kazimierz Dolny in Krakow was very influential. But there may be other examples. But then by the time, like the US Commission did one in Wyszków in northern Poland, where Mordecai and Yalowitz had come from. And then Sirok was done in 2014. There are lots of them. And now the idea of incorporating the broken gravestones into some kind of monument is rather common. And sometimes they're just put on walls. Like if you go to Berlin on the Grosse Hamburger Strasse synagogue, the old gravestones are just up against the wall, or in the Venice cemetery, they're just up against the wall when they move them from an old cemetery, new cemetery. But making a monument where there was destruction because of the Holocaust has become kind of common. I know there are dozens of these. I don't know if they're the actual number, but it's something that people seem to like. And then when there's more what's being done now, you saw the instance in Sedua, where they created this metal star as a lapidarium. That's also been different variations of that has been done as well at the in Warsaw at the old cemetery, and in Vilnius, different places. So, you know, they're coming up with solutions to keep these fragments. Medieval gravestones, like the ones that were just discovered in Germany, and I want to say in Cologne, but I can't remember where they were discovered. 17 stones were just recovered. They'll generally go. They'll go to a museum. So if you go to the museum in the Jewish Museum in Paris, in the Marais, you go in there, and there's an exhibition of medieval gravestones that were uncovered in the 19th century when they excavated where the Jewish cemetery had been under where now the Hachette publishing building is now. Anyway, so any more? Who's got?
Yeah. Natalie had a question. How do you find out if there's a cemetery being restored in a particular community? Is there a central database? So if someone's not participating and they're like, I know my family's from Vasky or another city, can they find out if there's a particular project going on that they may be interested in helping out?
Yeah, the best way, I mean, a general sort of roll call of things that are going on now is to go look at jewishheritageeurope.eu. On Marla's new thing, there's a list of recent projects, mostly, I think, maybe just in Ukraine, I don't know. But most, if you go through the genealogical societies, and the genealogical societies are often the ones that are instigating at least some of these projects, or some of their members are involved, you can find out if something's going on in your town. So through Jewish Gen, and then through the special interest groups for your particular region, you can pretty quickly find out if something's going on. Now remember, the spelling of the town may be different, so there are indices. I still use the Where Once We Walked, Gary Makotov's big book, to get all the different variations. I'm sure there are things online now that will tell you, but your best bet is to find out what the contemporary legal name of the town is in that country, and then to try it. But if you also have the old Yiddish name, try that. But remember, many towns have 4 or 5 names. They'll have Yiddish, Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, and German very easily. It's 5. So you need to try testing again and again and again till you find the information.
I got a few comments that people who wanted me to stress, and it's actually a question for you really, that their belief that the Nazis came in and decimated cemeteries and used the stones for paving stones. So my question to you is that actually factually correct? And let me ask a sub-question, which is, when I was in Lithuania and we traveled around, what we saw was that it really wasn't the Nazis. They may have started the process, but it was the Russians. The Russians would come in, and certainly in some of these towns, and completely turn Jewish cemeteries into other things. As for example, in Panevez, the cemetery is a park, and people are walking through a park, and now there's actually part of the park is a memorial for the fact that this used to be a Jewish cemetery. But so I guess the question is, how much of a role did the Nazis play in decimating? Did they really spend time, destroying Jewish cemeteries? And what role did the Russians play, for example, in destroying Jewish cemeteries?
Well, they both played their part. Definitely, it depends on the country. So Poland, very quickly, cemeteries were desecrated, and stones were used both for practical reasons and for ways to humiliate people. But you have to remember, they were coming in with tanks, and a lot of the roads were dirt and mud. So they wanted good roads, and these nice big, you saw how big some of those stones are. So if you can flatten them, or you just break them up and turn them into gravel, this was done a lot. And I mentioned the Kazimierz Dolny monument that was done in the 1980s. Those stones were retrieved from a local convent, but the Nazis had used the convent as Gestapo headquarters, and they had paved the entire courtyard of the convent so they could have their motor vehicles there, because they wanted that stuff. Because Poland gets very muddy, Lithuanian gets very muddy, Ukraine gets very muddy, and so there was a lot of that. But in the Czech Republic, in Czechoslovakia, the Germans did not routinely destroy cemeteries. In Hungary, They didn't destroy. So partly because of the timing. I mean, they came into Poland September 39, and they were vicious. And with the Russians, I'm not sure exactly what the timetable on the Russians during the war is. The Russians came in, of course, and occupied that whole area from 39 to 41. I'm not sure they were destroying cemeteries then. Most of the Russian destruction of cemeteries came much later when they instituted communist regimes. So in Lithuania, a lot of it was, and a lot of it wasn't until the 1970s. So some of the real horror stories that I've heard are from the 1970s. But all during this period, from the war and then immediately during the rebuilding period after the war, everywhere people took stones for building material. They had to rebuild their houses, they had to rebuild their roads, they had to rebuild their barns. So this was stone, it was useful, they took it. And it was not, there was no owner, nobody was using it. And that's how a lot of the stuff migrates into walls of houses and barns and things like that. And this is common. We see it in Salonika, in Greece. They raided the Jewish cemetery because 60,000 Jews were gone, and they just used all the stones for rebuilding. It's, for practical purposes. You could call it anti-Semitic because these people had no, sympathy or no interest or no knowledge. But they didn't go and take the stones saying, "Damn Jews, we're going to go and take their stones and ruin them." The Germans did some of that, though, because the Germans would force Jews to actually work on these road gangs where they would be destroying cemeteries. If you see a movie like Europa, the German, there's a scene in there where the kid is like breaking stone, ruining a cemetery. I think that's a little exaggerated because I think he sees the stone of like a relative, and that might have happened sometimes, but that was probably not the norm because the work gangs usually were taken from camps to cemeteries to do this.
My last question, given that we're over time now, I feel like it's a soccer game. And when we have you, it's like soccer game. We go into overtime. That's always the most exciting part, right? The overtime part of soccer.
I like a 3-hour seminar. That's what I'm used to.
So this is kind of a question about, maybe Marla and Jay can answer, or you're welcome to answer on their behalf, which is, why are Marla and Jay doing their project? What motivates them? So maybe Marla and Jay, could you unmute yourselves and just tell us a little bit about why you do what you do?
Can you hear us? Yeah, actually, if you go to the Rohatyn Jewish Heritage website, we have a whole page on media interviews I've done, including last summer. I always get asked this question, but very briefly, my grandmother was from Rohatyn. We made a genealogy heritage trip there after her death, and immediately were put in touch with a local who had been caring for the cemeteries and recovering headstones, who said to me, "What do you want to do?" And it was so unexpected. I didn't even know what he was talking about, that the upshot is when I went back home afterward, I thought, well, if not me, then who? And, he's doing this on his own, and he's been doing it for the last 20 years. So we pretty much picked up and moved to Lviv. And ever since then, we've been involved in this project.
So we can also say that on the Jewish Heritage Guide website, there's an about page there, and the about page describes the shift in our thinking about how to approach cemeteries and mass graves, how to document them, and so on. A lot of it comes back to actually Sam's work for the World Monuments Fund and for the US Commission, but you'll see in their motivation. And of course, if you look at the photos, I think probably anybody who looks at the photos on the website will have the same kind of reactions that we have. It just pulls you. It pulls you toward that.
Thank you. Thank you. We could read, and we will read your website, but to me, it was valuable to have you say something about what you do. It's much more powerful. So thank you for what you do, and we need more people like you doing work like that in Europe. So
Ari,
much appreciated.
say one more thing. You know, I want to say one more thing. What I learned when I was working with the World Monument Center Commission is that it's very hard to do work long distance. And so we eventually, for the projects that were successful, we found good partners who either were paid well, so they did the work well, or they had some other altruistic reason for working really hard and sticking with it. You know, even if you're doing a home improvement project, you know, working with a contractor, working with a bank, it can take months or years to actually get from the beginning to the end. Imagine doing this in a place where you don't speak the language, where there's not an infrastructure, where they may not have they didn't even have fax machines, let alone, you know, internet. You know, they didn't have, you couldn't even do a bank transfer. You had to, I once had to go to Poland. I carried $10,000 in cash strapped to my body, you know, in order to pay everybody. So this was the norm. So to have somebody to be there all the time is the way to get things done. Most people don't have that ability or that commitment. So Marla and Jay arranged their lives, you know, to do this, and it's really been incredible. They're not the only ones. There's some other people who are really, really dedicated, and there's some other organizations that have set up locally. But they're different from most of the big organizations because they've stayed in one place and made really established local personal connections that run pretty deep. So they have a really large network of local enthusiasts and helpers and informants, and, you know, a trusting circle. Whereas the big organizations, even some of the ones that I cited earlier, you know, they come in with a grant from the EU or the German, you know, they're in there for a couple of weeks doing some project, and then they're out of there. And they're not monitoring the situation week by week, month by month, year by year. I mean, I talked with Jay and Marla the other week. Their biggest concern is like knowing what's going on. They feel, you know, that they can't. They're like the custodians as well as the, you know, that they want to. They can't physically be to see how things, to check up on how things are doing. And what's happened over the last 20 years, a lot of local officials have stepped forward. We get government officials, we get church officials, we get school teachers, we get you know, foundations, other people locally. And those are the places where the work really gets done, where you have one person or a group of people who are willing to make a long-term commitment. But they need help, they need inspiration, they need money. So those are things that we can supply.
Thank you. Well, we've stayed almost half an hour over, so I appreciate everybody who stuck with us. Thank you for the presentation today, Sam. Thank you, Marla and Jay, for what you do and these examples of what's going on with preservation. And I think, you know, ultimately I go back to my trope, which is learn about your own personal genealogy. Everybody here comes from somewhere else. Even if you're a second, third generation American, you come from somewhere else. And I guarantee you spend hundreds of years somewhere else. Your family is not from America, and my family's not from South Africa, although we celebrate 100th anniversary of family. We're from Eastern Europe, hundreds of years. And so find out about your genealogy, find out about your community, and go visit if you can. If you can't go visit by going over there, we know COVID is a situation, but if you can't go, then go on virtual trips that we'll be organizing, other people are organizing. Find out what projects are going on in your hometowns and support them. And I think that's how we all make a difference. And maybe, I think I was having a discussion with Samuel before, don't just support your own programs, support in general programs of restoration, preservation of our communal Jewish history in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. And go on trips, come with CSP or other trips. And maybe we'll go visit Jay and Marla. I have to find out exactly where they are on the map. But maybe we'll come visit you, because it's pretty cool to go visit people who are actually doing work there. That is an incredible experience. So,
I got to say something. I see Ed Medros is on this call. Ed is doing what we're talking about in Eastern Europe. He's doing it in Chelsea, Massachusetts. He is the spirit and the sweat and the, you know, organizational skill behind the effort to continue the life of the great Walnut Street shul in Chelsea and turn it into keep it as a synagogue but also as a museum of all the other lost shuls in Chelsea. And it's an Orthodox shul, so it's almost the closest thing you'll get to going to Eastern Europe. If you're Chelsea's hit by COVID right now, pretty bad, I know, but Ed, we'll be in touch. I want to talk to you because, okay, it's good to see.
I'll end by saying two things related to what you just said. First of all, we were talking about Eastern Europe in this last session, this session, and next session. But I'm an immigrant. So I was born in South Africa. I'm a third generation South African. My family comes from Lithuania 100%. So I have very little connections in the United States. So many of you have connections, and you have your own cemeteries and synagogues that you need to preserve here. So, a lot of work for everybody. It's not just Eastern Europe, it's in America. We shouldn't forget what we have here. And regarding Ed, I was talking to someone who's connected to this shul, and I'm working on a Jewish heritage tour of Boston, so that I could find out about the city I grew up in. And one of our stops will be Chelsea. And I've actually learned in about the last 3 days, I probably learned more about Jewish history in Boston than most people probably who are Jewish in Boston know. And I'm trying to put it together. I'll be in touch with people like Ed. So when we go there, we will go into the North End, the South End, the West End, Chelsea, and learning about what happened in Boston. How did Jews get there? When did they get there? And what happened there? So that I can connect to my own, where I grew up, and other people connect to American Jewish history in the same way that we're talking about connecting to our Eastern and Central European Jewish history. So thank you, everybody. Good to see you. Lots of good work for us to do. Thank you for your work, Sam. We'll talk to you next week, and be safe out there. Enjoy the weather if you have nice weather, and make sure you get vaccinated, and if you're vaccinated, keep safe. Thanks, everybody. Take care. See you this week. Bye-bye.